The old bus sighed, a weary exhalation of air brakes, as it eased into the dusty terminal of Oakhaven. Arthur Jenkins, his frame stooped slightly by the unseen weight of 82 winters, gripped the worn armrest, his knuckles pale beneath the thin, papery skin. The journey had been long, a rumbling, swaying passage through landscapes that blurred into a monotone of fading greens and browns under the late autumn sky. He carried little, a single scuffed valise holding a change of clothes, his shaving kit, and a small velvet-lined box. Inside the box rested a photograph and a simple, polished stone from the creek bed that bordered the fields he's once tilled with his beloved Martha. Hours earlier, at a brightly lit, anonymous way station, Arthur had watched a young woman, no older than his granddaughter would have been, struggle with a fussy baby and 2 oversized bags. Her face was etched with a fatigue that Arthur knew well, the kind that settled deep in the bones. He'd risen slowly, his joints protesting with quiet clicks, and approached her. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice a soft rasp, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Allow me." He hadn't waited for an answer, just gently taken the heavier of the 2 bags, its strap digging into his own shoulder, and carried it onto her connecting bus, settling it carefully in the overhead rack. He'd then helped her find her seat, offering a small, understanding smile as the baby finally quieted against her shoulder. She'd looked up, gratitude welling in her tired eyes. "Thank you," she'd whispered. "Oh, thank you so much. People aren't usually." She trailed off, a hint of surprise in her tone. Arthur had simply nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "We all need a hand sometimes, child," he'd murmured, before returning to his own gate, the warmth of the small exchange a faint ember against the chill of his own solitary purpose in Oakhaven. He hadn't thought of it again, not as a grand gesture, merely as a thing one did, a small counterweight to the often unthinking momentum of the world. It was a principle woven into the fabric of his being, as intrinsic as the slow, steady beat of his aging heart. He was on his way to pay respects, a final, belated duty to a friend lost in a war that now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime, a different man. The act of kindness was just a pause, a moment of unthinking grace on a journey steeped in memory and a quiet, persistent sorrow. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Arthur stepped from the bus, the air cooler here, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Oakhaven was smaller than he remembered from the faded maps he'd studied. Its main street was a collection of low-slung buildings, their facades bearing the patina of time. He was a stranger here, an old man with a quiet quest, seeking nothing more than a place to rest his head before the dawn brought the duty he had traveled so far to fulfill. He clutched the handle of his valise, its familiar weight a small comfort. He did not consider the ripple effect of his earlier kindness, nor did he anticipate the currents that would soon draw him into an unexpected confluence of past and present. He was simply Arthur, a man who had lived long, seen much, and asked for little, moving through the twilight of his years with a humility that rendered him almost invisible, yet possessed of a spirit as resilient as the ancient oaks that gave the town its name. His thoughts were on a quiet patch of ground, a name etched in stone, and the words he had carried in his heart for over half a century, words he hoped to finally release. The small town unfolded before him, its streets quieting as evening deepened, unaware of the old soldier who walked its pavements, his purpose a solemn, private pilgrimage. Arthur found the Lamplighter Inn nestled at the end of a cobbled side street, its sign creaking softly in the evening breeze. A faint, yellowish light glowed from the lobby windows, promising warmth against the encroaching chill. It was not grand, but it seemed clean, and the online reviews had called it adequate and centrally located, which was all he required. His needs were simple: a bed, a wash basin, and a moment of peace before the morrow. He carried the weight of his journey not in his valise, but in the stoop of his shoulders, in the slow, deliberate measure of his steps. Each breath seemed to draw in the fatigue of the miles, the loneliness of the road. He pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into a small, sparsely furnished lobby. A scent of old wood polish and something faintly floral hung in the air. Behind a polished counter, a man with a precisely knotted tie and hair slicked back from a high forehead looked up from a ledger, his expression neutral, appraising. This was Mr. Henderson, the night manager, a man who saw the world in terms of bookings and balances, rules and regulations. "Good evening," Arthur said, his voice quiet, almost deferential. He placed his valise carefully by his feet. "I have a reservation. Jenkins. Arthur Jenkins." Mr. Henderson tapped a few keys on a computer keyboard, his lips pursed. "Jenkins, Jenkins," he murmured, his eyes scanning the screen. "Ah, yes. Room 2B. Single." One night, his gaze flickered over Arthur, a swift, almost imperceptible inventory of the old man's worn coat, his slightly frayed collar, the undisguisable weariness in his face. It was a look Arthur had encountered before, the subtle dismissal of age, the assumption of insignificance. "That's correct," Arthur affirmed, reaching into his inner pocket for his wallet. It was an old leather billfold, softened and darkened with age, holding a few carefully folded bills and a debit card he used for such occasions. He placed it on the counter. Mr. Henderson took the card without meeting Arthur's eyes again, swiped it through the machine, and frowned. He swiped it again. The small machine emitted a muted, negative beep. "It appears there's an issue with this card, Mr. Jenkins," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth, flat as the countertop between them. "Insufficient funds, it seems." Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. That couldn't be right. He was careful with his pension, meticulously budgeting for this trip. "Oh, there must be some mistake," he said, a touch of anxiety coloring his quiet tone. "I used it just yesterday. Perhaps try it again?" He knew there was enough. He'd checked before leaving. It was a modest sum, but enough for this. Mr. Henderson sighed, a small, impatient sound. He ran the card a third time with the same result. "No, sir. It's declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Arthur's mind raced. He had some cash, but he'd earmarked most of it for his return journey and a small meal. He hadn't anticipated this. A sudden, chilling thought. Had his account been compromised? Or was it simply a bank error, one he couldn't rectify at this late hour, in this unfamiliar town? I have some cash," he said, fumbling with his wallet again. "But perhaps not the full amount for the room right now. I can sort it out with the bank in the morning. I assure you the funds are there." He looked at the manager, hoping for a sliver of understanding, of trust. The manager's face remained impassive, a mask of professional detachment. "Hotel policy, Mr. Jenkins, requires payment in full upon check-in. We cannot extend credit, especially if a card is declined." He pushed the debit card back across the counter. "I'm afraid if you cannot provide payment, I cannot let you have the room." Arthur felt a flush creep up his neck. He was tired, so profoundly tired. The prospect of being turned away, of having to find another place in the deepening night, was daunting. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm an old man. I've traveled a long way. I just need a place to rest. I give you my word. It will be settled first thing." He didn't speak of his mission, of the grave he'd come to visit. Such things were private, sacred. He offered only his quiet plea, his visible exhaustion. He was unaware of the larger stage being set, of the audience that was, even then, gathering just beyond the inn's doors. He was simply a weary traveler, facing an unexpected obstacle, his humility mistaken for frailty, his quiet dignity unseen by eyes that only measured worth in currency. He believed in the inherent goodness of people, a belief often tested but rarely extinguished. Surely this man would see his predicament, offer some small leniency. Mr. Henderson, however, saw only a potential problem, a deviation from the smooth operation of his establishment. He straightened his tie, a gesture of finality. "I am sorry, Mr. Jenkins," he said, the apology sounding hollow, rehearsed. "Policy is policy. We are quite full tonight with the Regional Builders Conference, and I cannot hold a room without confirmed payment." He gestured vaguely towards the door. "Perhaps you could try the shelter down by the river, or the bus station waiting room might still be open." The words, though spoken evenly, struck Arthur like a physical blow. The shelter, the bus station. He, who had served his country, who had tended to the broken bodies of young men in fields of fire, was being directed to a shelter like a common vagrant. The deep weariness settled over him, heavier than any fatigue from the journey. He picked up his valise, his hand trembling slightly. "I see," he said, his voice so low it was almost lost in the quiet hum of the lobby. He didn't argue further. His pride, though quiet, was a deep-rooted thing. He would not beg. He turned, a solitary, stooped figure, and walked towards the door, the manager's indifferent gaze following him like a cold draft. As Arthur reached for the handle, the door swung inward, pushed open by a group of men, their laughter and deep voices momentarily filling the small space. There were about a dozen of them, their ages varying from middle-aged to men who, like Arthur, carried the silver of many years in their hair. They moved with a certain easy camaraderie, a sense of shared experience that Arthur recognized instinctively. Their faces were weathered, lined, but their eyes were alert, observant. They were, though Arthur did not yet know it, the 12 veterans in town for their annual support retreat, a gathering that had become a lifeline for many of them. One of them, a man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and kind eyes, noticed Arthur immediately. The slump of his shoulders, the valise in his hand, the way he seemed to shrink slightly as they entered. He saw the faint glimmer of moisture in the old man's eyes, quickly blinked away. This was Frank, a retired master sergeant, whose instinct for a brother in distress was as sharp as it had been 3 decades prior on dusty foreign roads. Arthur, startled by their sudden entrance, stepped back to let them pass, intending to slip out unnoticed. But as he did, his worn valise, nudged by the opening door, tipped and fell open at his feet. Its meager contents spilled onto the patterned carpet, a neatly folded shirt, a spare pair of socks, his simple toiletries, and the small velvet-lined box. The box, dislodged, sprang open too, revealing the faded photograph of a young man in a World War II Army uniform, his smile bright and confident, beside it the smooth, dark creek stone. Before Arthur could react, his face burning with embarrassment at this public display of his private effects, Frank bent down. "Here, let me help you with that, friend," he said, his voice gentle. His eyes fell on the photograph. He picked it up carefully. "A fine-looking soldier," he commented softly. Then his gaze sharpened, focusing on a tiny, almost invisible detail on the uniform collar in the picture, a regimental insignia, one he vaguely recognized from historical studies, from old tales told by his own father. Mr. Henderson, annoyed by the commotion and the sudden crowding of his lobby, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, if you are checking in," but Frank wasn't listening to the manager. He looked from the photograph to Arthur's face, a dawning understanding in his expression. He saw the faint, almost healed scar just above Arthur's left eyebrow, a silver line nearly hidden by wrinkles, a common enough mark of a long life, but in this context, it sparked a connection. He saw the set of Arthur's jaw, the quiet resilience that even humiliation could not entirely erase. "Sir," Frank said, his voice respectful, addressing Arthur. Did you serve?" Arthur, flustered, was still trying to gather his scattered belongings. "A long time ago," he mumbled, his cheeks still warm. "It doesn't matter now." He wanted to disappear. This public display of his vulnerability was an agony. "It always matters." Another veteran, younger, with a prosthetic leg barely noticeable beneath his jeans, said firmly from behind Frank. He'd seen the scene as they entered. The old man's dejected posture, the manager's dismissive wave. He'd seen men like Arthur before, men who carried their service silently, often forgotten. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Excuse me, but this gentleman was just leaving. He's unable to secure his room." His tone implied Arthur was a nuisance, a problem resolved. Frank straightened up, the photograph still in his hand. He looked at the manager, then back at Arthur, who was now slowly, painfully repacking the velvet box. The other 11 veterans had fallen silent, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene. A subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the lobby, the earlier boisterousness replaced by a watchful stillness. They had seen this script before, in different settings, with different faces, but the theme was tragically familiar. Neglect, dismissal, the world's short memory for those who had given their youth, their health, their comrades. Frank handed the photograph back to Arthur with a reverence that was palpable. "What unit was he in?" he asked gently, nodding at the picture. My friend, David," Arthur corrected softly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I. We were with the 10th Mountain Division, Italy, 44, 45. He didn't mention being a medic, didn't speak of the things he'd done, the lives he'd held in his hands. It was enough to name the division, the place, the time. For those who knew, it spoke volumes." A ripple of recognition went through the assembled veterans. The 10th Mountain, legendary. Stories of their brutal campaign in the Apennines were etched into military lore. Several of them exchanged glances. This old man, who the hotel was so quick to discard, was a part of that history, a living piece of it. "He's here," Arthur added almost to himself, his gaze distant. "David, buried here. His family moved to Oakhaven after the war. I never got to visit." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. The reason for his journey, so private, was now laid bare. Frank's eyes, which had seen so much, softened with a profound empathy. He turned to face Mr. Henderson, his stance no longer merely friendly but imbued with a quiet, unyielding authority. The other 11 men seemed to subtly shift, forming a loose, informal semicircle around Arthur, a protective barrier against the indifference of the front desk. "This man," Frank stated, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of command, "is a combat veteran of the Second World War. He's here to visit a fallen brother. And you're telling me he can't have a room?" The air in the Lamplighter Inn's lobby grew taut, charged with an unspoken challenge. Mr. Henderson, faced now not with one weary old man, but with a dozen resolute figures, shifted uncomfortably. "As I explained," he began, his professional poise starting to fray, "hotel policy clearly states—" "Policy?" Frank interrupted, his voice still low but edged with steel. "We're talking about decency, about respect. This man, and men like him, ensured you could have policies in a place like this, in a country like this." He took a step closer to the counter, the other veterans subtly mirroring his movement, a silent, formidable tide. "He's not asking for a handout. He's asking for a bed for the night, and he will have one." The group did not shout. They did not threaten. Their power lay in their collective presence, their shared understanding, their quiet, unwavering conviction. It was as if the years of discipline, of standing shoulder to shoulder in far more dangerous circumstances, had coalesced into this single moment of solidarity. They simply occupied the space, their disapproval, a palpable force. One man pulled up a lobby chair and sat down. Another leaned against a pillar, arms crossed. A third began to softly hum, a tune that was old, but instantly recognizable to those who had served. A melody of resilience, of brotherhood. They weren't leaving. Other guests, drawn by the unusual stillness and the low murmur of voices, began to peer out from the dining room entrance or pause on the staircase. A young couple, initially annoyed by the perceived obstruction, listened, their expressions slowly changing from impatience to something akin to shame, then respect. A waitress, hovering near the dining room door, watched with wide, sympathetic eyes. She'd seen Mr. Henderson turn people away before, always with that same cold efficiency. This was different. Mr. Henderson visibly paled. He was accustomed to compliance, to the swift resolution of inconvenient patrons. He was not equipped to handle a dozen determined men who exuded an authority that had nothing to do with financial statements or corporate directives. He looked from Frank's unyielding gaze to the faces of the other veterans, each one a silent testament to a code he did not comprehend. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Now, see here," he stammered. "There's no need for this. If there's been a misunderstanding—" "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Henderson," Frank said, his tone even. "There's only a choice. You can find Mr. Jenkins, a room, the best one you have, and you can offer him a sincere apology for this disgraceful treatment. Or we can all make ourselves comfortable here in your lobby for the night. And perhaps come morning we can have a chat with the owner of the Lamplighter Inn, and maybe the local newspaper. I hear they appreciate stories about how a town treats its veterans, especially its visiting heroes." The word heroes hung in the air. Arthur flinched slightly at the term, shaking his head. "No, please," he murmured. "I'm no hero. It's not necessary." He was deeply uncomfortable with the attention, with the confrontation being waged on his behalf. "It is necessary, sir," the younger veteran with the prosthetic limbs said, his voice firm but gentle as he looked at Arthur. "It's necessary for all of us." He then turned his gaze back to Henderson, a silent echo of Frank's resolve. The manager, trapped between the unyielding presence of the veterans and the potential for a public relations disaster, began to crumble. His carefully constructed facade of authority was dissolving. He fumbled with his keyboard, his earlier composure gone. Of course, we value our veterans," he said, his voice now attempting a placating tone. "Perhaps there was an error with the card machine. Let me see what I can do." He avoided looking directly at any of them, his eyes fixed on the computer's screen as if it held the solution to his predicament, rather than the moral imperative standing before him. The quiet power of shared conviction, of a bond forged in hardship and sacrifice, was slowly, inexorably, bending the rigid rules of the Lamplighter Inn to the shape of compassion. The lobby, moments before a place of dismissal for Arthur, had become a sanctuary, held by men who understood the true cost of service and the unassailable value of dignity. The silence in the lobby stretched, broken only by Mr. Henderson's nervous tapping on the keyboard and the almost inaudible hum from the old service tune, a quiet anthem of steadfastness. Finally, he looked up, a sheen of perspiration on his high forehead. "Well, it seems we do have a vacancy. Room 3A, a junior suite, actually. An upgrade, of course. Complimentary." His voice was strained, attempting a magnanimity that felt entirely false. He slid a registration card and a key across the counter towards where Frank stood, pointedly not towards Arthur. Frank didn't reach for it. He looked at Arthur. "Sir?" he deferred, a gesture of utmost respect. Arthur, his face a mixture of gratitude and residual embarrassment, nodded slowly. If it's no trouble," he said, his voice still quiet but steadier now. The weight on his chest had lessened, replaced by a warmth that spread from the solidarity of these strangers, these brothers he hadn't known he had until this very hour. He had come to Oakhaven expecting only solemn remembrance, perhaps a lonely meal. He had not expected this fierce, quiet defense. "No trouble at all, Mr. Jenkins," Frank said. Then he turned back to Henderson. "And the apology?" Henderson swallowed hard. He looked, for the first time, directly at Arthur, a flicker of something unreadable, shame, annoyance, fear, in his eyes. "Mr. Jenkins," he began, his voice stiff, "I apologize for any inconvenience or misunderstanding. We hope you will enjoy your stay at the Lamplighter Inn." It was a poor apology, clipped and reluctant, but it was an acknowledgment, forced though it was. Arthur merely inclined his head. "Thank you," he said softly. He would not gloat, nor would he press the advantage. Dignity, for him, was not about victory over another, but about the quiet assertion of his own worth, a worth now unexpectedly championed. Frank picked up the key and the card. "We'll see Mr. Jenkins to his room," he told Henderson, a statement, not a request. He then turned to Arthur, offering his arm. "Sir, if you'll allow us?" The other veterans made way, their expressions relaxing slightly, though a watchful sobriety remained. Two of them gently repacked Arthur's valise, handling the photograph and the velvet box with a care that spoke of shared understanding. Arthur, leaning lightly on Frank's arm, was escorted towards the elevator, a quiet procession of honor. As they passed the young couple on the stairs, the young man nodded respectfully. The waitress from the dining room offered a small, shy smile. Once inside the surprisingly spacious junior suite, with its clean scent and view overlooking a small lamplit garden, Arthur felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him anew, but this time it was mingled with a profound sense of relief. I don't know how to thank you all," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he sank into an armchair. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, sir, we did," Frank replied gently, while another veteran, a quiet man named Sal, poured Arthur a glass of water from a pitcher on the sideboard. "No one gets left behind. Not on the field, not back home. That's the code." They didn't pry into his past, didn't ask for war stories. Instead, they spoke of their own reasons for being in Oakhaven for their retreat, of finding solace in shared experiences, of the ongoing need for connection in a world that often moved too fast, forgot too easily. They learned he was a widower, that his trip to David's grave was a promise kept after decades. They spoke in low tones, a comfortable murmur of voices that filled the room with a sense of fellowship Arthur hadn't realized he'd been missing so acutely. He found himself telling them a little about Martha, about his small farm before he'd had to sell it, about the quiet rhythm of his days. He wasn't asked to be a hero, only himself, an old man with a story, with a grief he carried, with a service he had rendered. The recognition he received was not public adulation, but the quiet, profound respect of his peers, a balm to the sting of his earlier humiliation. It was a recognition that restored not just his access to a room, but a measure of his faith in humanity, a faith that had been momentarily shaken. They stayed for a while, not crowding him, but ensuring he was settled, that he felt safe and seen. It was a quiet vigil, a circle of protection drawn around him by men who understood in their bones the meaning of looking out for one another. The following morning, the sun rose pale and clear over Oakhaven. Arthur woke feeling more rested than he had in days, the tensions of the previous evening eased by the unexpected kindness he had received. After a simple breakfast, Frank and Sal, along with the young veteran with the prosthetic limb whose name was Mike, quietly offered to accompany him to the cemetery. Arthur, touched by their gesture, accepted. He had planned to go alone, but the thought of their silent company was a comfort. The cemetery was on a small hill overlooking the town, its weathered stones standing in neat rows under the watchful gaze of ancient oak trees. They found David's grave easily, a simple granite marker bearing his name, rank, and the dates that framed a life cut tragically short. Arthur stood before it for a long moment, the wind rustling the dry leaves around their feet. He opened the velvet box and took out the photograph, propping it against the headstone. Then, he took out the smooth, dark creek stone he had carried all these years from his own land, a piece of home, and placed it gently on top of the granite. He didn't speak aloud the words he had rehearsed in his mind for so long. They weren't needed now. His presence, the stone, the silent respect of the men standing with him, it was enough. He touched the cold granite, a final, silent farewell. Frank, Sal, and Mike stood a respectful distance away, a quiet honor guard, their presence a testament to an unbroken chain of camaraderie. There were no trumpets, no flags, just the solemn dignity of remembrance. Later, as Arthur prepared to board the bus for his journey home, Frank pressed a small, heavy object into his hand. It was a challenge coin, simple and unadorned on one side, bearing the insignia of Frank's old unit on the other. "Something to remember us by, Arthur," Frank said, his voice warm. "And a reminder, you're never alone." Arthur looked at the coin, then at the faces of these men who had become, in the space of less than a day, his unexpected allies, his brothers. "I won't forget," he said, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity, "any of this." Mike stepped forward. "Sir, it was an honor meeting you. What you and your generation did, it paved the way for us." He hesitated, then added, "That manager, Henderson?" The hotel owner called him this morning. Apparently, after we all left the lobby last night, some of the other guests, the ones from that builders' conference who saw what happened, they complained. Loudly. Seems Henderson's policies are under review. A small, wry smile touched Arthur's lips. He hadn't sought retribution, only peace. But there was a certain justice in the world sometimes. As the bus pulled away from Oakhaven, Arthur sat by the window, the challenge coin cool and solid in his palm. He watched the town recede, then turned his gaze to the passing landscape. The late autumn fields, though barren, held the promise of future harvests, of renewal. The small act of kindness he had performed for the young mother at the way station, a gesture given freely, without thought of reward, seemed to have circled back to him, magnified tenfold in the solidarity of the veterans. He hadn't sought glory, only a quiet space to honor a friend and find a measure of peace. He had found that, and so much more. The world, he reflected, could be a cold and indifferent place, quick to forget. But it also held pockets of extraordinary warmth, of fierce loyalty, of quiet courage. He looked out at the vast expanse of the sky, a canvas of soft morning light. A sense of tranquility settled over him, deep and abiding. He was old, yes, but he was not invisible, not forgotten. And in the quiet beat of his own resilient heart, there was a renewed sense of hope, like the first stirring of spring beneath a winter field.